In the spring of 1861, a man named George Pullman crawled into a covered trench beneath a 6-story brick hotel in the center of Chicago, where 500 laborers were already kneeling along a line of iron screws in the dark. Above their heads stood the Tremont House, one of the finest hotels in the West, with its guests asleep in their beds and its dining room still serving supper. On a signal from a single foreman, every one of those 500 men gave the screw in front of him a slow half-turn, all at once, and the entire building rose a fraction of an inch into the air. They would do it again and again for days, until that hotel had climbed 6 full feet above the muddy street it was born on, and not one guest was ever told it was happening. The man who designed the impossible plan that made all of this necessary was a Boston engineer named Ellis Chesbrough, and he had looked at the whole city of Chicago, sunk in the swamp at the edge of Lake Michigan, and decided that the only way to save it was to lift it. I went looking for the full story of how an entire American city jacked itself up out of the mud by hand, 10 feet in places, while business went on inside. What I found is one of the strangest and boldest things Americans ever did to a city they had already built. And almost no one walking those same downtown blocks today has any idea the ground beneath them was raised by human muscle. So let me show you what it actually took, and why a young city had no choice but to lift itself off the earth it stood on. To understand why anyone would raise an entire city by hand, you have to understand the ground Chicago was built on. The place was a swamp. The land at the mouth of the Chicago River sat only a few feet above the surface of Lake Michigan, a flat and soggy prairie with almost no slope to carry water away. When it rained, and it rained often, the water had nowhere to go. It sat in the streets. It pooled under the wooden sidewalks. It soaked into the cellars and stood there for weeks. The soil was a heavy black clay that held water like a sponge and turned the roads into something closer to porridge than pavement. For a town that was growing faster than almost any city in the history of the country, this was not a small inconvenience. It was a daily, grinding misery that touched every life in the place. The mud of early Chicago became famous, and the people who lived there learned to joke about it the way people joke about a thing they cannot fix. Travelers wrote home about streets so deep in mire that wagons sank to their axles and had to be abandoned where they stood. There is a story, repeated so often in those years that it became a kind of civic legend, of a man found sunk to his shoulders in the muck of a downtown street. When a passerby offered to help, the buried man waved him off and said he was fine because he had a good horse under him. Somebody planted a sign in one particularly bottomless intersection that read, "The shortest route to China." Another sign, stuck in the mud beside a half-swallowed cart, simply warned, "No bottom here." People laughed because the alternative was to weep. A trip of a few miles across town could eat a whole day. Carts threw their loads, horses broke their legs. The city tried laying planks of wood over the worst of the streets, but the water gathered underneath the boards and rotted them, and the planks warped and heaved and sprung loose, so that walking the sidewalk became its own small adventure in falling through. But the mud was only the surface of the problem, and the deeper trouble was the thing the mud was hiding, because the water that could not drain away was killing people. A city that cannot move its water cannot move its waste. The privies and the cesspools and the runoff of 100,000 people had nowhere to flow, and so it sat in the same standing pools that filled the streets, soaking back down into the wells the city drank from. Year after year the fevers came. Typhoid and dysentery blighted Chicago summer after summer, 6 years running by some accounts, and then in 1854 the worst of all arrived. Cholera swept through the crowded low blocks near the river, and before the season was out it had killed something on the order of 1,500 people, about 6% of the entire population of the city in a single year. Think about that number. 1 in every 16 or 17 people in Chicago, dead in one summer because the town could not drain the water it stood in. This was not bad luck, it was geography, and the men who ran the city finally understood that no amount of patience would fix it. The swamp had to be conquered, or the city would keep burying its own. So Chicago reached for the one answer big enough to matter, and it began with sewers, because a city drowning in its own filth needs first to carry that filth away. In February of 1855, the state of Illinois created a board of sewerage commissioners and gave it the authority to do what the city had never managed. The commissioners knew they were out of their depth, and so they did the wise thing. They sent east for the best man in the country, and the man they found was Ellis Sylvester Chesbrough. He was a Boston engineer who had just finished designing the water system that brought clean water into that older city, and he had a reputation for solving exactly the kind of problem Chicago faced. Like so many of the great American engineers of that age, Chesbro was largely self-made. He had little formal schooling and had learned his trade young, out in the field as a rodman on the early railroad and canal surveys of New England, walking the lines and learning the land by measuring it. He came west to Chicago in 1855, and the city made him its chief engineer, and he walked the ground and studied the problem, and arrived at a conclusion that nobody wanted to hear. The conclusion was this: Chicago could not drain its sewers because Chicago sat too low. A sewer works on the simplest principle in the world, the same principle that carried the Croton River into New York and the Erie Canal across the state. Water runs downhill. To carry waste out of a city by gravity, you need the pipes to fall steadily toward the place the water will go, in Chicago's case, toward the river and the lake. But the land was so flat and so close to the level of the lake that there was no downhill to be had. If you buried the sewers in the ground the way every other city did, the bottom of those pipes would sit below the level of the river they were supposed to empty into, and the waste would simply lie there and never move. Chesbro did the arithmetic and saw that the ground itself was the enemy. The city was built at the wrong height. A lesser engineer would have given up or proposed some half measure that bought the city a few years. Chesbro proposed something that sounds, even now, like a kind of madness. If the ground was too low for the sewers, then the answer was not to lower the sewers. The answer was to raise the ground. He would lay the great brick sewer lines not down in trenches but right on top of the existing streets, build them up out in the open, and then bury them under several feet of new earth. The fill that covered the sewers would become the new surface of the city, a new street grade lifted high enough that the pipes beneath it could finally fall toward the river and drain. Across the downtown, he proposed to raise the level of the streets by anywhere from a few feet to as much as 10 feet. He was not proposing to fix Chicago's foundation. He was proposing to give the entire city a new one, several feet up in the air, and to do it while 100,000 people went on living and working in the buildings that already stood on the old low ground. If the idea of an American city lifting itself out of the mud by hand is the kind of history you came here for, I want to tell you that the older story behind it, the Erie Canal that taught these men how to move the impossible, is now a book, the full illustrated account of how that canal was dug across New York with shovels and wheelbarrows before the machines existed. You can scan the code on your screen and start reading it tonight. Now you can see the problem the plan created, because raising the streets was the easy half. Dirt does not care if you pile more dirt on top of it. The hard half was every building already standing on the old grade. Once the new street rose 6 or 8 or 10 feet, every brick storefront and every wooden house and every grand stone hotel in the downtown would suddenly find its ground floor sitting in a pit, its doorways below the level of the road, its first story turned into a half-buried cellar. The city could not simply abandon what it had built. The whole business district, the banks and the hotels and the dry goods stores, the brick blocks that held the wealth of a booming city, all of it sat on the old low ground, and all of it would have to come up to meet the new street. And so the engineers of Chicago faced a question that no city had ever really faced at this scale. How do you lift a finished building, made of brick and stone and weighing thousands of tons, several feet into the air, without cracking a wall or breaking a window or stopping the business inside even for a day? The answer was the jackscrew, and it is worth pausing on this tool, because the entire raising of Chicago rests on it. A jackscrew is a beautifully simple machine. It is a heavy iron screw set in a threaded base, and when you turn the screw with a bar, it rises slowly and lifts whatever sits on top of it. And because of the mechanics of the thread, a single man turning the bar can raise a load far heavier than he could ever lift with his hands. One screw under one corner of a building does very little. But the insight that made Chicago possible was that you do not use one screw. You use hundreds of them, or thousands, set close together all across the underside of a building, every one of them carrying a small share of the enormous weight. Crews would dig in under the foundation, shore up the walls, and place the screws in dense rows beneath the load-bearing courses of the building. Then men would station themselves at the screws, often one man to several screws, and on a signal they would all turn together, the same small amount, so the building rose level, and even a fraction of an inch at a time, with the weight spread so widely that no single point was ever strained enough to crack. As the building inched up, other workers slid timber cribbing into the growing gap beneath it, building a tower of wooden blocks to hold the structure while the screws were reset higher, turn crib, reset turn again. It was slow and it was patient, and it was almost entirely a matter of human muscle moving in unison. The first time the city tried this trick on a large masonry building was in January of 1858, and the test could not have been more public. The building chosen stood at the northeast corner of Randolph Street and Dearborn Street, a 4-story brick structure about 70 feet long and weighing some 750 tons. To raise it, the crews placed 200 jack screws beneath the walls, and over the course of the work they lifted that entire brick building 6 feet and 2 inches up to the new grade, and the contemporary accounts marveled that it was done without the slightest injury to the building. No cracked walls, no broken glass. A 4-story brick building that had stood on the low ground was simply, quietly, lifted 6 feet into the air and set down on a new foundation, as if the whole thing were nothing more than rearranging furniture. The city had its proof. The thing could be done. And once Chicago knew it could be done, the raising became a kind of fever. What followed over the next decade and a half was unlike anything happening in any other city on earth. Block by block, building by building, downtown Chicago lifted itself up out of the swamp. Whole rows of stores went up together. Hotels went up with their guests inside. The work became so common that visitors to the city wrote home in astonishment about what they were seeing. Buildings hanging in the air on forests of screws, men crawling in the trenches beneath them, the constant slow groan of timber taking up weight. And the most astonishing part, the part that made Chicago famous around the world, was that the city never stopped. The stores stayed open. The hotels kept their rooms. A shopper could walk into a dry goods store on Lake Street, buy a bolt of cloth, and never quite realize that the entire building was several inches higher than it had been the day before, and would be higher still by the week's end. The city was rebuilding its own foundation in mid-stride, without ever breaking its pace. The single greatest demonstration of this, before the hotels, came in 1860 on Lake Street, and it is the feat that truly told the world what Chicago was doing. The target this time was not one building but an entire half block, the whole north side of Lake Street between Clark Street and LaSalle Street, a continuous front of brick and stone storefronts, 320 feet long. The combined weight of that block of buildings came to something like 35,000 tons. To lift it, the contractors brought in 6,000 jack screws and 600 men. The men were spaced along the screws beneath the buildings, and at the call of the foreman they turned together, the whole block creeping upward at a rate of about 12 inches a day. In 5 days, they raised the entire 320-foot block 4 feet and 8 inches, all of it at once, every store in it open for business the whole time. The newspapers reported, with something close to disbelief, that in the course of lifting an entire city block 35,000 tons in weight, not a single pane of glass had been broken, and not a crack had appeared in the masonry. The work cost about $17,000, and it was carried out by a partnership of the city's best raising contractors, men named Brown and Hollingsworth, Ely and Smith, and a young firm called Pullman and Moore. That name, Pullman, brings us to the man at the center of this whole story. Because of all the people who raised Chicago, the one whose path tells you the most is George Pullman, and his path begins, of all places, on the Erie Canal. George Mortimer Pullman was born in the small town of Brockton, New York, in 1831, the son of a carpenter named Lewis Pullman. And here is the detail that ties this entire story together, the same way the axemen on the Erie tied together the story of New York's water. Lewis Pullman was not just a carpenter. He had invented and patented, in 1841, a machine that used jack screws to lift buildings off their foundations and move them to new ground. In 1845, the family moved to the town of Albion, right on the Erie Canal, because New York was widening the Great Canal, and the widening meant that dozens of buildings standing in the path of the work had to be picked up and shifted out of the way. Lewis Pullman moved them, and his son George grew up at his elbow, learning the trade of lifting heavy buildings and walking them to new foundations, in the very corridor of the Erie Canal that had taught a generation of Americans how to move the impossible by hand. When Lewis died in 1853, George took over the family business at the age of 22. 3 years later, in 1856, he won a contract with the state of New York to move 20 buildings out of the path of the still widening Erie Canal. He was, by his middle 20s, one of the most skilled building movers in the country, and he had learned every bit of it on the banks of the canal that runs like a thread through so much of this history. And then he heard what was happening out west. He heard that the young, rich, growing city of Chicago was trying to lift itself out of a swamp, and that it needed men who knew how to raise heavy buildings without breaking them. So in 1859, George Pullman packed up the trade he had learned on the Erie Canal and carried it to Chicago, the way John Jervis had carried the Erie's lessons down to the Croton a generation before. The same skill, learned on the same waterway, applied to a wholly different impossible task, 1,000 miles away. If you are new here, and this is the kind of history you have been looking for, the quiet engineering and the named men behind the things we take for granted, take a second to subscribe or to join the channel as a member for early access to every new film. It is the simplest way to keep work like this going. Pullman's first job in Chicago was the Madison House, a large brick hotel, and he raised it 5 feet in under a month, with the hotel never closing its doors. He and his partner Charles Moore went on to raise building after building, and they were part of that consortium that lifted the Great Lake Street block. But the job that made George Pullman a legend in the city, and the job that stands as the single most theatrical moment in the whole raising of Chicago, came in 1861. The Tremont House was one of the grandest hotels in the western United States, a massive 6-story brick building on the corner of Lake Street and Dearborn Street, full of paying guests and famous for its comfort. The owners wanted it raised to the new grade, 6 full feet, and they did not want to close the hotel for a single night to do it. They wanted the bar open, the dining room serving, the rooms rented, the whole machine of a luxury hotel running at full speed, while the building it lived in floated up 6 feet into the air beneath everyone's feet. So George Pullman took the job, and the way he did it is the thing people still talk about. He dug covered trenches in under the foundations, out of sight, so the guests would never see the work. Into those trenches he placed roughly 1,000 jack screws, set in dense rows beneath the load-bearing walls of the 6-story hotel, and then he assigned about 500 men to those screws, each man responsible for a small handful of them. Every man drilled to do exactly one thing on command. At the signal, each of the 500 men gave each of his screws the same slow half-turn, all together, all at once. The entire Tremont House rose a small fraction of an inch. The cribbing went in beneath it. The screws were reset, and it happened again. Day after day, half-turn after half-turn, 500 pairs of hands moving in perfect unison in the dark beneath the floor. The great hotel climbed slowly toward the sky, and the guests, by every account, went on with their lives. They ate their meals. They slept in their beds. The story passed down is that the lifting was so smooth and so gradual that the only sign anything was happening was that, over the days, a guest might notice that the view from his window had changed, that the street outside was lower than it had been, that his window, which had once looked out at eye level, now sat several feet above the road. The building had risen around him, and he had never felt it move. By the end, the Tremont House stood 6 feet higher than it had been born, undamaged, fully open, and George Pullman's name was made. It is worth standing for a moment with the men in those trenches, because they are the part of this story that the Marvel tends to hide. The raising of Chicago was not done by George Pullman alone, or by Ellis Chesbrough alone. It was done by the hundreds of laborers crouched in the dark beneath those buildings, turning screws by hand for days at a time. Many of them were immigrants, Irish and German men who had come to the booming city for work and found it in the trenches under its hotels and stores. They worked in cramped covered cuts beneath thousands of tons of brick, with the whole weight of a building held up by nothing but iron threads and stacked timber, trusting that the man beside them would turn his screw the same amount at the same moment, because if the load went up unevenly, the wall above them could crack and come down. It was patient, disciplined, dangerous work, and it demanded an almost military coordination from men who were paid by the day and counted by the head. For most of them, the ledger gives no name, only a number. They were hired, drilled, and replaced. But the buildings they lifted did not fall, and the walls they raised did not crack. And the precision of what they did, hundreds of hands moving as one, is the real engine of every famous photograph of a Chicago block hanging in the air. The raising kept on through the 1860s, and the engineers grew ever bolder about what they would attempt. In 1865, a contracting firm took on the Robbins Building, an iron-fronted block weighing something like 27,000 tons, and lifted it on more than 1,500 jack screws over the course of about 21 days. In 1866, the Briggs House, a large brick hotel, was raised 4 feet and 2 inches to meet the grade, with something like $50,000 spent on the building in the process. Block after block, the downtown rose. The new sewers, laid on the old ground, disappeared under the fill. The streets climbed to their new height, and a great deal of that fill, the earth that became the new surface of the city, came in part from the bottom of the Chicago River itself, dredged up out of the channel and hauled into the streets so that the river was deepened for shipping. At the same time, the land was raised for drainage. The city was quite literally remaking the ground it stood on, lifting the land and lowering the river in one connected act of engineering. Not every building in the city was worth the trouble of raising, and this produced the other great spectacle of those years, the one that astonished visitors almost as much as the lifting did. The downtown brick blocks were valuable enough to raise in place, but Chicago was full of older wooden buildings, frame houses, and small frame stores that were not worth the cost of jacking up to the new grade. So instead of raising them, the city's movers simply picked them up whole and rolled them away. They would jack a wooden house up off its foundation, run timbers and rollers underneath it, hitch it to teams of horses or to a capstan, and walk the entire house down the street to a new lot, often out toward the edges of the city where the old low grade did not matter so much. To a newcomer, the effect was surreal. A Scottish traveler named David McCrae, visiting Chicago in those years, wrote that never a day passed during his stay in the city that he did not meet one or more houses on the move, shifting their quarters through the streets. Picture that. You step out onto a downtown street and a two-story house comes creaking past you on rollers, the family's curtains still in the windows, drawn by a team of horses, while beside you a brick hotel hangs 6 feet in the air on 1,000 screws. For roughly 15 years, this was simply daily life in the city of Chicago, a town in the act of physically rebuilding itself in mid-air and on the move. When you add it all up, the scale of what the city accomplished is hard to hold in the mind. Across the downtown, over the years from about 1858 into the early 1870s, the streets and the buildings of central Chicago were raised by anywhere from 4 feet to as much as 14 feet, with much of the core lifted in that 6 to 10 foot range that Chesbrough had proposed at the start. An entire commercial district, the beating heart of one of the fastest growing cities in the world, was picked up off the swamp and set down again several feet higher, building, by men turning screws. There was no master machine that did it. There was no single great engine. There were thousands of jack screws and tens of thousands of turns and hundreds of disciplined men, repeated across block after block until the whole city stood on higher ground. It remains one of the only times in history that a major city, already built and fully occupied, deliberately raised its own elevation by hand, and did it so smoothly that ordinary life barely paused. The legacy of all that lifting is still under the feet of everyone who walks downtown Chicago today, even if they never notice it. When the streets rose and the buildings came up to meet them, the city had to rebuild its sidewalks at the new higher level, and in many places the new walk was laid out over a hollow space, leaving a buried layer of the old ground floor and the old sidewalk down in the dark beneath the new one. To this day, parts of downtown Chicago have what are called vaulted sidewalks, walkways with empty space underneath them, a faint architectural echo of the moment the whole city stepped up out of the mud. The drainage that Chesbrough fought for did its work, and the cholera and the fevers that had killed by the hundreds slowly loosened their grip as the standing water finally found a way to flow. The city that had buried 1,500 of its own in a single summer learned to drain itself, and it grew and grew into the great metropolis on the lake that we know now. And George Pullman, the building mover who learned his trade on the Erie Canal and made his name lifting the Tremont House, took the fortune and the reputation he had built in those trenches and turned them toward a wholly new idea. The skills of moving heavy things smoothly and building them well did not leave him when the raising slowed. By the middle of the 1860s, he had begun designing railroad sleeping cars of a comfort no one had seen before, and in 1867 he chartered Pullman's Palace Car Company, which would put his name on the sleeping cars of nearly every railroad in the country for the rest of the century. The man who had quietly lifted a city out of a swamp went on to remake the way America traveled across the continent it was busy stitching together with rail. The thread that started on the Erie Canal ran through the mud of Chicago and out across the whole of the country. I think about what the raising of Chicago really represented, and I keep landing on the same idea. It was not only an engineering trick, though it was certainly that. It was a decision a young city made about its own survival. Chicago could have stayed low and kept burying its dead. It could have decided that the swamp was simply its fate. Instead, it chose to do something that no rational person would have called possible: to lift an entire occupied city several feet into the air by hand, store by store and hotel by hotel, and to keep the whole place running while it did. The city bet an enormous amount of money and labor on the idea that the ground itself could be conquered, and it won that bet. And the metropolis that rose on the new high ground is the proof. Now, I want to be honest about the easy version of this story, because the raising of Chicago has become a magnet for a certain kind of myth. You will find, if you go looking, a whole genre of videos claiming that the buried ground floors and the vaulted sidewalks of Chicago are evidence of some lost civilization, some great flood of mud that swallowed an ancient city whole. That is nonsense, and the documents are clear about why. The lower floors of Chicago are not buried under the silt of a mysterious cataclysm. They were buried by the city itself, on purpose, with carted fill dredged from the river, on the published plans of a Boston engineer named Ellis Chesbrough, lifted into place by named contractors like George Pullman over a span of years that the newspapers reported week by week. The truth is stranger and far more impressive than the myth. No lost civilization raised Chicago. The people of Chicago raised Chicago, with their own hands and their own screws, and they wrote down exactly how they did it. Which leaves me with a harder question, and I am going to hand it to you. We tend to assume that the truly difficult feats of building had to wait for the great machines, for the hydraulic jack and the crane and the engine. But the men who raised Chicago had none of that. They had iron screws, timber cribbing, mule teams, and a discipline so exact that 500 men could turn as one and never crack a wall. They lifted a city while it ate its supper. So here is what I keep wondering. If a city today were told that its downtown sat too low to drain, and that the only fix was to raise every building several feet, do you honestly believe we would even attempt it the way Chicago did, all at once, by hand, without closing a single store? I have my own answer, and I am not at all sure it flatters us. I would like to hear yours, down in the comments, because I do not think the question is nearly as settled as we like to pretend. If you want the deeper origin of all of this, the Erie Canal that taught George Pullman how to move whole buildings before he ever saw Chicago, the full illustrated story is waiting behind the code on your screen. Scan it, pick it up, and thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. I will see you at the next one.